Finance Committee will come to order. The Finance Committee is here today to discuss how to meet the country's extraordinary need for investment in roads and highways and other infrastructure projects. My bottom line is you cannot have a big league quality of life, and you certainly cannot have big league economic growth with little league infrastructure. The status of our roads and highways affects all Americans, from commuters to exporters to rural Americans who drive long distances for just about everything. And in the global competition for investment and jobs, the condition of our infrastructure is a major determinant of how the outcome plays out. By any calculus, our investments in infrastructure lag way behind the competition. China, for example, invests 8.5% of its gross domestic product in infrastructure, and in some parts of Canada, they invest 10%. The U.S. invests only 1.7%. No American can be happy with the prospect that it is easier to move goods from a Chinese factory to a Chinese port than from an American factory to an American port. That's what's at risk here. The American Society of Civil Engineers, the trusted gurus, so to speak, of infrastructure, write an annual report card that grades our country's roads and highways. In 2013, we earned a D+, not exactly anybody's definition of success. The report found that nearly a third of our roads are in disrepair and nearly half of our highways around cities suffer from congestion. Americans waste millions of hours and more than 1 billion gallons of gasoline sitting in traffic every year. That's what has to change. Now, there are two priorities to consider. The first is reauthorizing and fixing the Highway Trust Fund, which feeds money into transportation projects. Unfortunately, it has less money coming in than it has going out. Fixing it in the short term will require $10 billion to keep the fund solvent through the calendar year. Getting through fiscal year 2015 will take another $8 billion. What happens if the authorization expires or if the fund dries up? According to one report, 6,000 projects grind to a halt, putting many thousands of construction workers out of a job and causing headaches, what I call traffic migraines, from one end of the country to the other. Then, for the longer term, the Congress needs to find a sustainable source of funds that will keep this crunch from happening again. It would be a tragic mistake to let highway funding become another stop-and-go extender like Medicare physician payments have been and many other important tax incentives. Relying on short-term policies, emergency patches, and temporary extensions makes forward-looking strategies impossible. And when it comes to infrastructure, our business community advises that planning ahead is absolutely essential. Some proposals offered over the last few months, like using new tolls on existing roads or charging motorists based on the number of miles they drive, in my view, raise questions about privacy and feasibility that would need to be answered. We are going to examine them thoroughly. It's going to take $100 billion just to keep the Highway Trust Fund solvent for 6 years. Meeting that bar will give the states a chance to think ahead, and construction workers won't have to worry about being laid off because of Washington inaction. And while the Congress develops fresh, long-term policies for the trust fund, it should also consider ways to encourage Americans to use the cleanest and most efficient fuels. But we ought to face it. Fixing the trust fund is just the bare minimum in terms of the investment needed. It is time to aim higher and to do it on a bipartisan basis. That's where the second priority comes in, getting private capital off the sidelines and into this effort. There are a whole host of innovative proposals. I see Senator Warner is here, Senator Blunt, Senator Bennett, Senator Schumer. A number of my colleagues have bipartisan proposals for the long term. And the only place you have to look to find proof that you can get private capital off the sidelines is the Build America Bonds program. The Build America Bonds program had been proposed by Democrats and Republicans for years and years when it was finally included in the Economic Recovery Act. In this very hearing room, colleagues, senators we hoped that it might generate $5 to $10 billion worth of infrastructure projects over its lifetime. By the time the Recovery Act period was over, Build America bonds had helped to finance more than $180 billion worth of projects in my home state and from one end of America to another. So the lesson is clear. There are hundreds of billions of dollars in private capital sitting on the American sidelines. Some of that can surely be invested in American infrastructure. So I'd like to aim higher and do everything possible to build a bipartisan coalition for policies that generate $1 trillion in American infrastructure. From a purely commercial standpoint, investing that capital in critical American infrastructure projects certainly has the potential to be more profitable and improve more lives than a number of the alternatives. It's important not to punt investments further into the future. Maintaining a good quality road is cheaper than rebuilding a failing one, especially while interest rates are low and it's tougher to invest in new transportation projects if the country's roads and highways are falling into disrepair. The price tag for a strong national infrastructure is only going to grow in the future, so it is time to get to work. Finally, before I recognize Senator Hatch and introduce our colleague, the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee, who has been a passionate advocate for transportation, fortunately, I want to take a moment to recognize the unfortunate passing of our former colleague, Jim Oberstar. Jim Oberstar spent his entire career working on transportation policy, first as a staffer who worked on the legislation that created the Department of Transportation in the 1960s, then during the years that he represented Minnesota's 8th District, more than 3 decades in the House. He was a titan of transportation policy, especially in aviation. All who fly in America should be grateful to Jim Oberstar, and I would just like to say, because I think some colleagues didn't get to serve with him, I didn't get a chance to serve with anyone more decent and caring than the late Congressman Jim Oberstar, and I just wanted to recognize his passing this morning. Senator Hatch.